Hi there, and welcome to this episode of Nocturnal Transmission E Pluribus COVID. My name is Ryan Kerr, and I'm your host, and I'll be speaking with Sarah Gardiner, who is not only a childhood friend of mine, but also a union organizer for an independent food and hospitality union that works across North America and internationally. Sarah and I talk about what it means to be an essential worker and what unions can do to support workers who are, going through it right now. So stay tuned and enjoy the show. Bye. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Ryan.
How are you?
I am as good as it gets.
Well, just like that famous Jack Nicholson and Helen Hunt film, then you're just a high grosser. So you have been a staunch supporter of Nocturnal Transmission, the Instagram version, and now in this podcast iteration. So I'm going to just very publicly say thank you for that. But also, we have history. We've known each other for a long time. So it's so cool to be in contact still. And one of the things that's fun about this opportunity of me being a host of my own making is that I get to chat with whomever I choose. And you are quite an interesting person, as well as being smart and friendly and familiar. And I think that part of us getting to know each other in this pandemic environment has been lots of sharing back and forth and learning more about what we're up to these days. And so I was very excited to learn that you work as a union. So your official title is not union rep, is it?
My official title is organizer. So
Organizer.
For those of us who work either on properties with members who are already unionized, or if there are folks working in the industry who would like to be unionized, either way, what we do is you organize people the way that like activists organize similarly.
Woohoo! So you wear signs around your neck and flags on your shoulder, and you stand in front of businesses and you say, hey, hey, ho, ho, unions are the way to go.
Yeah, the unions are the power. They're the power of the people, and the power of the people won't stop.
Oh, that's even nicer. How did you get into that work? Because you used to work in food and beverage.
Yeah, so I have been working in food and beverage on and off for 20 years. So I had my first job in the service industry when I was 16, as lots of folks do. And how I got into union work is, that could be loaded in the sense that I grew up in a neighborhood that was fairly mixed income and a lot of low income, which is where we grew up.
Yep, I know it well. Cabbagetown.
Yeah, Cabbagetown, St. Jamestown, and Cabbagetown. What's interesting to note about it is that it's sandwiched by two lower income neighborhoods. There at least was. I guess the one on the south side has been gentrified.
Yes,
or is in that process right now. But I think that so when you grow up in that kind of environment, our experience really informs our perspective. So there was a lot of left-leaning politicians at the time, and my parents certainly volunteered for those left-leaning politicians. And so I would say that I grew up, with a certain kind of mental framework for it. But I would also say that necessity is the mother of invention. So how long ago is it? Just a little over 2 years ago, I got hired as a low-level manager, so front house food and beverage manager. And I kind of did that because it's hard to tell that I'm getting older.
It is hard to tell. Did I get it right? Did I say it at the right time?
Let's not get into it. Vanity's one of the 7 deadly sins. I was working as a low-level manager in a boutique hotel, and the nuance and the detail of that is a little bit tricky and complicated, but essentially there had been folks working there for 10 plus years who hadn't received a raise in that time. So their initial wages when they were hired 10 years ago were good and in fact progressive, but then you give it 10 years later and now they're behind the mark because inflation has gone up. We all seen, and in Toronto specifically, inflation isn't just, it's not inflation as the country goes,
no,
2%. So like in Canada, inflation goes up every 2% every year, supposedly according to the major banks. But you live in Toronto, real estate is insane and through the roof. And frankly, I wasn't sure how anybody, if I was struggling on my low level manager salary, I knew that everybody in that property was struggling. And it got to the point where I became very frustrated. And it was actually, I had a very bright bartender who was working under me, who I was managing, who could tell I was frustrated with the situation that we were dealing with. And he was the one who suggested unionization. But
Oh,
he was about 10 years younger than me. And, when you're young and bright eyed and you're like, that's a great idea. And
yes.
then I gave it about 6 days. And, I'm an elder millennial. I Googled hotel and hospitality union. I found one. I met with them. I met with them a week later. I brought in the bartender who had mentioned the union activity, and it took us from the day I called the union to the day we went to vote was 9 weeks.
That's pretty fast, isn't it?
It's really fast, and we're
Yeah.
lucky in Canada because in the States, and obviously this varies from country to country, but in the States, you might get enough cards to file for a union, but you might not have an election until a year, and laws will fight it, and the company will try to coerce the employees the entire time. In Canada and Ontario, it's 5 working days from the day that you file to the day that somebody comes on property from the Ministry of Labor, a voting officer, and they have a formal election.
Wow.
And the election is majority, the way that it is in Parliament. So it's 50% plus one.
Right.
So that's what you need to get in order to win a union in Ontario. And so exactly a week later, it goes to vote, and then you get a certificate, and then you start the bargaining process. And
Wow.
that is how I became involved with union work.
So now the only thing I know about unions really is from the 1990s hit musical Ragtime, when Emma Goldman, she sings a song about how the Coke bottle makers are working in unsafe conditions, 8 days a week for 1 cent a year. And it was a very compelling song.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess what I learned from that is that unions are meant to protect our wages, but also safety conditions.
Correct.
Also, what else do they do? Like that I mean, I'm being a little bit facetious here, but they create an envelope, right? That if your employer is not taking care of employees, or if then there's an outside bias, right? Like an outside person that comes in and does some oversight.
Yes and no. So yeah, unions are definitely meant to protect the employees, and when we talk about those kinds of inflations, they're meant to get annual cost of living increases or raises as they bargain them in the negotiation process. Yes, they are there to protect their health and safety. So some of that health and safety, and this is what's kind of tricky because, as you know, not everything is so obvious, right? So health and safety might be, what's your workload look like? Is it too heavy physically? So, it's a hotel and hospitality union that I work for. Our most vulnerable members are typically the housekeepers, who are typically women and typically women of color or immigrants, and they are cleaning. They're very laborious jobs, right? And so we need to make sure that we manage that, because in any occupation, when we talk, if we're going to talk about the ergonomics of a chair in an office, then we got to talk about what it's like to lift beds every day, what that does to your hips and your back. Make sure that not only are they not doing too much work that would injure their bodies, but make sure that they have benefits for physiotherapy or any benefit that somebody would have in an office. Unions are meant to protect the employees from that, also harassment of all kinds, especially all workplaces have instances of various kinds of harassment, be it sexual or ethnic or otherwise. And so that's one thing that union do. And then I guess finally the point that I wanted to make on, does somebody come in and protect them? Not necessarily. Yes, sometimes. Sometimes there's something called a grievance process, and that's sometimes what happens. Sometimes what we need to make the point to the employer is to have what we call an action. Actions don't necessarily have to be a full stoppage of work, which is what we call a strike. Actions can be sometimes you might get all of the staff in a department to wear a pin of their union so that the managers see that the staff are united and they're not going to take nonsense. And so, what you
Hmm.
have when you have a union is people, as you know, I mean, the word means one. So, it's like actually the idea of e pluribus pluribus
Unum.
unum, right? Like it's the idea of everybody banding together. And so your problems are my problem, and we're going in this together because it's the power of many, right?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
that's what we call collective action.
Yes. It's like a condominium, except for good.
Just like a condominium.
So okay, so now I'm going to play devil's advocate, and many people say that the devil has already enough advocates, but in the gig economy, and we're talking pre-corona, we're talking pre-pandemic fun.
Mhm.
I mean, I worked in the service industry, and I remember transitioning into the office world and being encouraged to do things like take a break and make sure you have a lunch hour and don't work after,
Mhm.
all of these things that never occurred to me because in the, in the service industry, if you want to make lots of money, then you work really, really hard and you don't take any breaks. And, but you get rewarded handsomely financially for all of this, right? So a lot of people, I know a lot of people who are very, very, or who were very successful servers, and they would, um, I think if they were pressed, a year ago, they would say, well, I don't need to take a break. I'd much rather make this money. And so I can imagine there being resistance to unions from the perspective of certain workers who would say like, well, I don't mind working the extra so that I can, like these human rights abuses are minuscule compared to the payout that I get.
So I think that person, it depends on the institution that you're in, and it also depends on your position in the institution. So uh, food and beverage, the service industry, like in the union that I work for, is arguably the hardest. It's one of the hardest departments to unionize, to convince that they even need a union. Now, some people will go into it because they're like, oh, I've experienced that sexual harassment, I know what that's like, and I want protection from that. So that's those are some kind of obvious points. Some people in the service industry who are tipped based workers are afraid that their money is going to be taken away by the union, or that it's going to be pooled, or it's going to be lessened somehow, and that's not the case. But in terms of like taking breaks and simple things like that, it's like, okay, well, look, nobody's saying that you need to take that break during peak hours of business, but let's imagine that you are not the server who is making all of that money, but you're the hostess. And you've been working on your feet for 8 hours. Maybe you're going to be a little bit hungry, right? What if you're the person in the kitchen, and you also make a lower wage, or a wage that is based on the idea that you're not making tip money, or if you are getting tipped out, it's certainly much smaller by comparison. And then here's something that's really important to note: who is working in the kitchen and who is working in the front of house. And in my 20 years of service, I can tell you there's a whole bunch of brown people in the back of the house, which isn't exclusively true by any stretch imaginable. But there's a lot of systemic racism that exists in those kinds of environments, and who is able to make the money and who isn't able to make the money. And so, when you do the work of organizing, you're really trying to get people to look at the broader perspective. So that kind of idea that you're in it for yourself is kind of a libertarian idea,
Hmm.
right? And like, well, if I can do it, then other people can do it. And people can't always see the invisible barriers that make it harder actually for one person to do it and another person not to do it. But ultimately, when you're going into this, it's been my experience that even those folks who have those kinds of hangups around unions, a lot of them are myths and they're not true, and they have issues in the workplace. It might come down to scheduling of seniority or what have you,
Hmm.
but you can typically get through to them if you just go through it, have the conversation, realize that they're not going to have a bunch of things taken away from them, and that overall, when you get them to really look at their colleagues, that they kind of go, you know what, I do wish that person was making more, and I would like them to have a break. And I mean, I don't, whether or not I believe in the goodness of people, I must, you know what I
Yes.
mean?
Yeah.
I don't give
Yeah.
it a lot of thought, but I must believe ultimately that people are good.
I remember when I worked, I used to work, I mean, I've worked in a bajillion different service, like retail, food and beverage jobs. I remember once in a retail job that the hiring or whoever was doing the scheduling was mad at me that day, and they knew that that would affect my scheduling for the next week.
Mhm.
And I remember being like, "Oh, I really wish that she wasn't in a bad mood, or I hadn't hurt her feelings, or whatever, whatever in my high school self, whatever it was, because I knew that that would affect my income for the next week."
Yeah,
And it literally just occurred to me now that maybe that wasn't the right thing for my scheduling manager to do. Like it
of
just
course.
like of course the onus was on me in that moment to be like, well, I guess I shouldn't have said that thing, but it shouldn't have affected my wages for the next 2 weeks.
Yeah, and it's kind of funny, right? Because you're looking at it from the perspective of being much older than a teenager, but the fact of the matter is that most of us think that we internalize it as our fault for not having enough, for not being good enough, for not trying hard enough, and so there's really this like I would say overall social psychology that's involved in it as well when it comes to class structure and who has enough and who doesn't, right? We kind of like you're not alone in that, and that's not just the thinking of a teenager. I think that lots of folks who are full grown adults think, well, I could have done something
I could
this,
have
or
done it
if they
better.
don't think it,
Mhm.
their colleagues think it because their colleagues go, well, I'm fine,
Yeah.
right?
So okay, so this is a good baseline for what the work is that you do, and I think why it's important. And then we have this minor pandemic happening, and
Yeah.
certainly I don't want to say that food and beverage has been the hardest hit, but it does
The
seem
hotel and hospitality was first hit, hardest hit, longest to recover. And it's the same in the SARS crisis as well. So this actually it's not, I think especially recently, especially in the events of the last week, I've kind of like, it's actually not all unprecedented. The only piece that's new is this technology piece that we have. But essentially, all the things that are happening now have actually happened in the past.
okay. And so how does that change your work and the kinds of concerns that are filtering up to your to the union?
So when this happened, I think it was only 85% of our union members were laid off, and now we're at about because we're in this lockdown phase now. I think it's about 90% of our members have been laid off. So hotels are still open right now, but they're just functioning on very low levels. And of course, there are a lot of procedures and standards in place that weren't in place before. But that's like my local has a little bit under 8,000 members, and 90% of those members are at home. They've been at home the entire time. I think one of the things that's really important to note is when you are a working class person, you're in a situation like this. Yes, we have government support. As we've been discussing, Toronto is a fairly expensive city to live in. People had incomes because they were unionized members that were above minimum wage, which means that their standard of living was geared to their income, as everybody's is,
Hmm.
right? So we spend what we earn. And losing that income means that these folks have been put in a position of either needing to sacrifice quite a bit, or the thing that they're sacrificing is the risk of getting sick. So let's say that they are either still employed or they go to look for new work. When you're in that class bracket, which I think is really important to point out because not everybody has been affected by this, and this is really, really important, is that you are putting yourself at risk for minimum wage work. And so, what's frustrating for me as someone who works with the people who are either disenfranchised by staying at home and not having enough money right now, they're disconnected from their jobs, or they're worried that they might not get their jobs back. And that's a more complicated discussion that we can get into later. But the other thing too is that I have folks who are servers, they're bellhops, and they are risking their lives for $15 an hour. And for me, it's absurd that a server would become an essential worker and have to go into work and have to risk their lives. But what else do we do in, as you rightly pointed out, a gig economy? The thing about crisis like this is that these problems existed before, but now that there's even less, the disparity has become really, really apparent, right? And it's come to the the forefront on the surface. But, as I've been speaking to friends in the service industry, not all of whom are unionized, one of the things that I've been asking is, are folks tipping more? Because me personally, I feel that, like, as ridiculous as it sounds, like, I have an onus to spend money to keep the economy going. Like,
Yes.
this
Yeah.
this is how you know you live in capitalism, when me doing right by my fellow citizens is spending money.
Yes.
But, like, my friends who are bartenders and servers, they're saying that people are getting takeout because they can't eat in restaurants, and they're not tipping more than. And these folks aren't necessarily making more than a server wage. So what do you do? I even had, sorry to keep going about this, but I have another a friend who works in a juice bar, and he was saying to me that nothing has really changed for him because he was the person who was always on the schedule, and he's been essentially been working throughout the entire thing. And he said, at some point, it was stressful enough that I was kind of jealous of my server friends who were at home collecting the cash while I'm here doing what I've always done, but risking your life and still having to work and still having to do labor, and how challenging that is.
Yeah. And there's also, some people have been compensated more or more stably by the government than they were making in their gig jobs. And I know that, people who worked at coffee shops part-time, for example, they're making more money now, or they were making more money on the monthly benefit than they were in the coffee shop. And then coffee shop owners are saying, hey, do you want your job back? And they're like, not really.
Yeah, and that's happening in my properties as well. So the properties that I rep, they're having a hard time getting the employees back. And we had to bring this up with management. It's like, well, why would you go back to work when your health is at risk and do a job for less money than you're making at home? So it's interesting, just while we're talking about the raising the wages. So as you know, like the grocers got a wage bump and then it was taken away from them.
Yes.
And how ridiculous is that?
Yes.
And I can tell you that, like, the folks that work in our hotels, they didn't get a wage increase because of this, because they weren't considered essential workers in the same kind of capacity. And even if they had, it would have been taken away. And what Galen Weston Jr. said about it was sort of like, what did he say? He was just sort of like, well, if the other investors think it's cool, then I guess I'll go back to it. He was essentially like, I'd love to keep that wage, but my other investors don't agree. So, back down. But I will say this, not all players are bad players. And Chapman's Ice Cream,
yes,
which is a family-owned business in Ontario and has been for quite a long time now, I think like 80 years or something, raised their workers' wage to something like $18.50, and they maintained it because the kid who inherited the business, he was like, I can't take away their wage, which is the right answer. And the thing about it is this, what's really interesting about it is when I started getting into this work and realized that I would need to convince even more people to be involved in unions, and they didn't know what it was and they didn't know the history, again, I Googled it. so what I can tell you is that roughly 30% of Canadians have unionized positions. So it's like the big ones like teachers, teachers are unionized, government employees are unionized. And then we've got, of course, the Steelworkers Union, and there are tons of unions, right? But it's
no one in the Rose Gold Union, though.
Pardon?
There's no like fun metal unions like the Rose Gold.
Oh, the Rose Golds. Yeah. I love Rose Gold.
I do too. I think it should be a union.
Yeah.
Okay, anyway, carrying on. So there's lots of unions, including steelworkers.
So in Canada, it's 30% of 33 million people are unionized. So now my union it's an international union, hotel and hospitality union, meaning it actually stretches across North America, and actually some of the islands too have properties that are unionized with us. But what was I going to say? Unions.
Lots of them.
Okay, right. So 10% of America is unionized. And as you know, they have much more of a manifest destiny, a libertarian kind of overall viewpoint, whereas Canada is a socialist democracy. Mm-hmm. So, right, the degree of socialism is definitely up for debate, and it's been dwindling over the past 30 years. But fundamentally, the states have the cultural attitudes about, if you can make it there, you can make it anywhere. But essentially, you're on your own, kid, for the most part.
Yeah.
Whereas European countries, so Finland, for instance, has something like 60% of their population unionized, and then Iceland has like 90% of the population is unionized. And so the question when we talk about this kind of social correlative science is sort of like, okay, well, are those places unionized because the government had good policies around it? Or does the government have good policies because the people came together through collective action and changed the way it was? And if you look
Ah,
at the history of revolutions across Europe, and this is really the thing, is that we haven't had a full blown revolution in North America, although it looks like those things are coming up now, to be frank about it. But the history of that kind of socialist society where you have a much higher taxation system, it's harder to be an aristocrat. And folks have access to, when a child is born, that there's more money involved.
yes.
You can go to school at any time for any reason. So, there's always kind of this in the West, when you talk to capitalists and then you're talking to folks from America or Canada, you run into a lot of people who are like, but I deserve this and
Yeah.
I deserve that.
It wasn't
And what
easy
they're
for
talking
me. It
about-
shouldn't be for you neither.
Pardon?
It wasn't easy for me, so it shouldn't be easy for you neither.
You get a lot of that. You get that from folks from all over. There are people in all positions, for immigrants and otherwise, who will tell you that story.
Yes.
So you do get this kind of like, and then there are also people that come from communist countries and have a lot of feelings about what the government restricts. So there's a lot of perspective involved. But I guess what I'm saying is this what the government should do? Or do we have to collectively organize and decide what's best for us in a democratic process, right? So it's kind of this, is it the chicken or the egg kind of a scenario?
Yes.
And I just think it's interesting to note that stuff and point to it and look at what works and what doesn't work. And I think one of the other things too, that I find particularly interesting is that when we look at this stuff, there are also measures of, they like rate countries by happiness scales. But when they talk about happiness, they're talking about, they have two scales for it. So there's happiness in terms of content, which is what they have. And then if you look at countries that are closer to the equator, where there's a lot of sunshine, there's another happiness scale, which is how much do you laugh and have fun and enjoy life, right? So your social security is far more precarious in lots of these countries, but the sun is shining. There's a very vibrant culture. And, I think a lot of this, as you know, comes down to social connectivity.
So back to unions real quick. Actually, back to coronavirus real quick.
Yeah, let's talk about it.
What can be done now to protect, like when you're saying 90% of your members are currently unemployed? I mean, what does the future look bleak? I mean, because hospitality, as you say, it's the slowest to recover, and we don't see an end in sight for what's happening. What's gonna happen?
So with the emerging strains, that becomes particularly challenging to see what the formal outcome of this is. But let's take the optimistic road for a moment. So for our members to make it through this crisis, and for people who are not unionized to make it through this crisis, I think, so for our workers, we have something called recall rights. So under the Ontario Employment Standards Act, if you can be laid off from your job temporarily if there isn't enough business. If you're laid off for 35 weeks or more, the company has an obligation to pay you severance for the time that you've worked there, okay? But under our collective bargaining agreements, most of them have 52 weeks, which is a year from the time that they were laid off to the time that they can be recalled. As you know, we're coming up on the year mark. So one of the things that we did as a union is that we went to these companies and we said, we would like our members to not lose their jobs because of this pandemic. So can you extend these recall rights up to 2 years instead of 1 year? Because if we're looking at a reasonable trajectory of when the economy could recover, we feel much safer knowing that people aren't going to be called. Sometimes like it could be called for favoritism reasons. It could just be the company being cheap and not wanting to increase labor for the workers and then not bring back more workers so that their numbers on paper can look good. Because we know that for rich people who own hotels, it's just like Monopoly. They're not worried about eating. They're just talking about the numbers on the computer screen. That's really what it is. Right. So there are recall rights. that we've been, and a lot of the companies have agreed to this. They're we work with them anyway, and they don't really want to necessarily train new workers, etc. So there's a degree to which that's happening. That's one measure. That the second thing that we need to be concerned about is that, as it is EI again in Ontario. So here's something that I think this is really interesting to point out. In the early 90s, or prior to 1990, in Ontario, employment insurance was actually called unemployment insurance the way it properly should be. And there's this kind of funny vernacular change that came in. And a lot of it is Mike Harris and wanting to change the scope of work for welfare programs, as you recall, right?
Yes.
Because poor people are lazy, as you know.
That's the only
Like,
reason. That's the only reason they'd be unemployed.
the lexicography is really important because it shapes, as you know, through an Orwellian perspective, the way that people think about things. But nevertheless, so employment insurance for many people will end a year from the time that they claimed it. And so what are they going to do in the interim? I believe what we've seen from the government is that they're saying that they're not leaving people behind. That's not the full story. Again, the way that the subsidies and financial support programs have come into place are, again, like class-based. They didn't really know a lot about the service industry. So our union has, hired a lobbyist at the beginning of this to kind of say, hey, like, this is what it's like if you're in this industry. So I have a faith, whether or not this will happen or not, but I think that there are so many people in the service industry who are employed at mass numbers that kind of support will continue past this point. And so we'll see how that kind of works out. What's different about this crisis than the SARS crisis is that when SARS broke out in 2003, as you recall, what's different about it is that it was localized to Toronto and Montreal. So people were still traveling and spending money. They just weren't doing it here, which is why that fundraiser happened. So what's kind of, I guess, again, like, to my optimism in wanting and hoping and fighting to make sure that this goes in the right direction is that people are going to travel and they're going to spend money because they want to do that, because the vaccine has come out. And now this, kind of like xenophobic fear of going to a place where there was a localized virus is no longer the threat or problem. So,
it's a shared fear.
It is. So the benefit is that, maybe it's different for the UK, but it's just as risky, to go to Toronto as it would be to go anywhere else. And so that would be something else that I would see in terms of an optimistic outcome. But those are the main factors. It's staying connected to your jobs. We've seen, 90 restaurants close across Toronto during this crisis?
I think more.
Yeah. So I don't know, but I fail to see how it's going to be okay for that. Like even if you're a capitalist and you're like, man, those people should be working. There needs to be jobs, even if they're not the same jobs and they don't make the same amount of money. And right, I think at one point at the very beginning, it was 8.8 million people were laid off immediately. Then as we kind of went into that phase in the summertime where it was a little bit safer, there was something like, it was like half that number, right? So it's like, then we still have 4.4 million Canadians who are unemployed, which is a very large percentage of our population. And so the question becomes, what happens with those folks? Some of those folks will get their jobs back, as I think that the corporations are going to be so desperate for their quarterly losses that they're going to open up as soon as possible. They are going to have deals, they're going to have specials, and they're going to do everything they can to stimulate the economy and get paying folk through the door. That is happening, but there's still going to be this gap. And so, we do need to be thinking about where are those workers going to be connected to their jobs? Are they going to have enough money and support? Can we put them into other workplaces? So just with that in mind, there is one thing I'd like to say, which is that one of the things that I'm really grateful for is that our union had created an educational resource website for members to take training courses. So one of the examples that I like to bring up is I have an audiovisual member from the hotel that I unionize, who had taken a forklift training course. And I just think it's so cool because I can't imagine her going back into a situation where she's DJing or worrying about the sound at a party anytime soon. Like, that wedding isn't happening, I don't think. but we know Amazon's making a lot of money and they're hiring. So she can, now she's got this certificate that says not only can she do the job, but if you're able to operate something like a forklift, you make a couple dollars extra than if you can't.
Yes.
So that was one of the things that I was grateful for, that our members at least had some of these educational resource tools to be able to transition, because from a realistic perspective, are all of them going back to their jobs? Certainly not right away.
How can those of us who have not had our income affected, how can we make a change right now?
So I think ultimately, to your point, look, the government should be increasing wages, and and should be mandating it, and Galen Weston and his pals should be doing it, but they're not. And so look, I mean, this is the whole big discussion about tip based work to begin with, but ultimately, yeah, you know what, if you're working at home and your income hasn't been affected and you have that money and you're spending it, give that 20-25% tip, right? Because and I think one of the things, what's tricky about Canada and the way that we have a tip structure, in the States, that again has this far more like libertarian kind of mentality. They're tipping everybody. They're like, if there's the cabbie, there's the bellhop, there's anybody who's done something for them, they're given a couple of dollars to. And we don't have that culture. We have an old culture of that we used to tip 15%, and some people from the past generation will tell you that 15% is before tax.
Yes. Yes.
Don't do that. Tip 20% after tax.
Right.
Okay, yeah. because we've kind of seen this shift, especially in Toronto, as we've become a more cosmopolitan city. I think that right now, if you have it, you need to be thinking about that. So you might go into somewhere and say, well, they just did takeout, so it wasn't service, so why should I tip for it? And you should do it because they're making the same money that they were before, and you would have eaten there anyway.
Yes.
And it's less about the work that they've done, but the fact that they're still doing the work.
Yes. And so many restaurants as well that have become takeout only because they've been forced to by the government. Yeah. Those servers, they're the servers who are now handing you the takeout food. And so they used to be making all of their wages and tips and are now only getting, their wages. So
that's right. So that's kind of why it's important to do it. And I think that the other thing too, that's really important is that remember that's a person, and if your order's a little bit late, that maybe that's okay, and you're not actually suffering. Because I think that one of the things that has also happened is this pandemic has brought a lot into light, is that people have a tendency to confuse inconvenience with suffering. And I would just like everybody to take a step back and remember that you may be frustrated in this moment, but there's no reason to be rude or unkind to the person that's helping you.
Thank you. That is the reminder that we all need.
Well, we do. And we all need to be like, wait a minute, let's just put this in perspective.
For one quick sec. Yeah. Well, thank you very, very much. I really appreciate your taking the time. And fingers crossed that the next time we communicate, your job has gotten easier, because so has everyone else's jobs.
Yeah. Let's hope for an expedient rollout of vaccine and recovery of the economy.
Yay! Well, thank you, Sarah. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.